Factoring polynomials in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. There are two things we want to discuss in this lesson. First, just factoring trinomials that are in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, and then also review factoring trinomials by grouping. Let's first start off with factoring by grouping. To refresh our memory, to factor by grouping, the first thing we want to do, remember, is convert all of this to addition. It's not mandatory, but if you convert to addition, it minimizes any possible mistakes that you might make. And then we want to group the first two terms together and then the next two terms together. So now we have these two terms and we have these two terms. Let's look at the first parenthesis. In this set of parentheses, what can we factor out of each term? It seems to be a 3x squared. And in the second set of parentheses, we can factor out a -2. Now you never want to leave this leading coefficient as negative, so that's why we want to factor out a -2 as opposed to factoring out a +2. When we do that, we have this. So we factored out our 3x squared from this term and this term, and factored out a -2 from this term and this term. Next thing, factor out the x plus 3. If you remember from an earlier lesson, our factors will be the two factors that are left in the parentheses. That will be one of our factors, and then the stuff on the outside of the parentheses will be our other factor. So if we factor out an x plus 3, our factors for this polynomial will be x minus 6 times 3x squared minus 2. Please pause the video and try to factor by grouping. Okay, the first thing we want to factor, put in parentheses our first two terms, and then put in parentheses our next two terms. Looking at our first set of parentheses, we can factor out a 2 from the coefficients and an x squared from the x terms. In the next set of parentheses, it seems as if we can factor out nothing, but you can always factor out a 1. So in this case, we factor out a 1. You never want to say factor out 0. So when I factor out a 2x squared from the first set of parentheses and a 1 from the second set of parentheses, I have this. So my factors will be, once I factor out 5x minus 3, that's one of my factors, and then what's left over, that's in red, that's my other factor. So now, we want to factor a trinomial in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. This form is slightly different from lesson 6.2 because if you notice, the leading coefficient in this case is not 1. So this problem is a little bit longer than if the leading coefficient would have been 1. So the first thing we want to do is we want to understand that we're still going to use product sum, but in this case the product will be the blue and the sum will be the red. So we would ask ourselves, what is our product? 3x squared times 8 is 24x squared. Our sum is always our term in the middle, 14x. So now we're going to write down all the possible factors of 24x squared. Which one of these can I add together and get 14x? X squared, I'm sorry, 2x, 12x. So we're going to now substitute this sum in for 14x. So now once we do that, we have 4 terms. Once we have 4 terms, we can factor by grouping. So we're going to take our first 2 terms, put them together, and our second 2 terms, put them together. So what can we factor out of the first 2 terms? And what can we factor out of the second 2 terms? Well, I can factor out an x from the first. I can factor out a 4 from the second set of parentheses. And then remember, we want to now factor out 3x plus 2. So our factors will be the stuff in the parentheses, that's one factor. And then the stuff that's not in the parenthesis will be the other factor. So one factor, 3x plus 2, and the other factor, x plus 4. And now, you always want to check your work, so we can FOIL back to check our work to see if we get the original quadratic that we started with. So if we FOIL, we end up with this. When we combine like terms in the middle, we end up with this. And if you remember, our original quadratic was 3x squared plus 14x plus 8. Check. Please pause the video and try to work this problem. Okay. First, product sum. Our product, remember, is not just negative 25. Because the leading coefficient is not 1, the product is the first term times the last term. And our sum is still the same. It's in our middle. It's our x term, so negative 5x. And then we want to write down all the possible factors for negative 50x squared. And then we ask ourselves, which one of these can I add together? So I know when I multiply them together, I get the product. But which one of these numbers can I add together and get the sum? And it appears to be this one. So I'm now going to substitute this sum in for negative 5x. And since I have 4 terms, I want to now factor by grouping. Out of my first set of parentheses, I can factor out an x. Out of my second set of parentheses, and remember, we do not want this leading coefficient in the second group to be negative, so we want to always factor out a negative if that is a negative. So I can factor out a negative 5. The stuff inside the parentheses should always be exactly the same. If they're not the same, then you have made a mistake someplace. So I'm going to factor out 2x plus 5. That's one factor. My other factor is x minus 5, or x plus negative 5. We can always check our work by FOILing to make sure that we end up with the quadratic we started with. Combine like terms in the middle. Check. please pause the video and try to factor this trinomial. Okay, first, product and sum. The product is 60x squared. The sum, negative 19x. So, our possible factors. Because negative 1x times negative 60x is positive 60x squared, and so on and so forth. So now which one of these can we add together and get negative 19x? And that is negative 4x and negative 15x. Factor by grouping. So I can factor out a 2x from each one of these, and I can factor out a negative 3 from each one of these. What's inside the parentheses will always be the same, and that's one of my factors. And the stuff outside the parentheses will be my other factor. You can always FOIL back to check your work to make sure that you are correct. If you FOIL back, you end up with this. Combine like terms, you end up with this. Check. This problem seems to be a little bit more tricky. However, let's try to attack it. First, I'm going to first factor out a monomial. Factor out a monomial first. So I can factor out a 2 from each one of these coefficients. I can factor out an x from each one of these x terms, and I can factor out a y squared from each one of the y terms. Now I have this. So one of my factors will be this term right here, 2xy squared. My other factors will come from what's inside the parentheses. So I'm going to use product sum. The product, remember, will be 3x squared times 12y squared, which is 36x squared y squared. And my sum comes from this term in the middle. So we ask ourselves, what can you multiply together to get 36x squared y squared? Those same two factors you would add together to get 13xy. So here are our possible factors that will give us 36x squared y squared. And if you notice, right here at 4xy and 9xy, that sum will give me 13xy. So that's what I want to use. And inside my parentheses, I have 4 terms. So I want to factor by grouping. So I want to factor by grouping. Remember, one of my factors is already this first term out front. Don't forget that. And so to factor by grouping, I want to factor the first 2 terms together. Group the first 2 terms together, and then group the second 2 terms together. So I factored out an x from each one of these terms, and I factored out a 3y from each one of these terms, and then what's inside the parentheses are the same. I know I'm on the right track. One of my factors, 3x plus 4y, the other factor, x plus 3y. And don't forget, that term out front is still a factor. So my factors are here. Check our work. You can FOIL first and then multiply by this monomial. and you get what we started with. Check. Please try these for extra practice. And make sure you complete the Math Lab questions on 6.3 and 6.4. Thank you.